There's a couple of announcements I just want to make briefly before I hand it over to Linda to introduce our speaker. So just to keep on your calendar, we have kind of a bonus lunch and learn this month. It's next Tuesday at noon, August 24th on Zoom. And we are having a town hall in conjunction with Jewish Community Relations Council with Senator Brian Williams and Representative Shamed Dogan. And the two of them work together in a true bipartisan effort to produce historic reforms to the justice system last session. So it should be a really interesting talk. I encourage everyone to sign up and come to that. It's from 12 to 1:30. Obviously, you don't have to stay the entire time, but the two of them really worked hard together. And I think it would be really interesting to see how that process came about. And then finally, I want to let you know about our Lunch and Learn next month, which is September 23rd. Normally it's the third Thursday of the month, but next month is all of the holidays. So we have it on Thursday, the 23rd, which is the fourth Thursday. And we're having Denise Lieberman, who a lot of you know, who is the foremost expert on voting rights in this area. So we're excited to have her back because there is a lot going on in Jeff City and nationwide regarding voting rights. So we hope you can make it. If anyone has any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. My email is jbernstein@ncjwstl.org. And be sure and sign up also for our 5 Ways to Advocate if you haven't already done that. Comes out every Monday. I'm going to hand it over to Linda now. And again, thank you all for coming today.
Thank you, Jen. I'm Linda Dahl, co-chair of NCJW St. Louis's Lunch and Learn program. We are thrilled to welcome Jason Hancock, editor-in-chief of the Missouri Independent, for today's Lunch and Learn, where he will provide a recap of the 2021 Missouri legislative session. Jason has been writing about Missouri since 2011. He has worked for some of the largest news organizations in the Midwest, including the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and most recently as a lead political reporter for the Kansas City Star. He has spent nearly 2 decades covering politics and policy for news organizations across the Midwest, and has a track record of exposing government wrongdoing and holding elected officials accountable. Over the years, Jason has been honored with numerous state and national journalism awards and has been repeatedly named one of the best political reporters in America by the Washington Post. And without further ado, Jason Hancock.
Thank you so much for having me. Am I coming through okay? Did I successfully unmute?
Yeah.
All right, and apologies in advance we have a relatively new cat, so if she makes an appearance today, that will be just a bonus for the Lunch and Learn. She might have some thoughts on the legislative session. I sort of broke up the session today knowing I was going to be speaking to you into 3 kind of big categories. And I'll try to be somewhat brief just because I know that I want to keep as much time as possible to answer your questions or dig into topics that you specifically want to dig into. But so the 3 topics that I thought of today to kind of delve into what the 2021 legislative session and the special session we had this summer on the FRA would be some of these big historic bills that were years in the making that the legislature was able to get across the finish line. Secondly, some of the big things that were left undone, and in a lot of ways, the session is going to be remembered for those things just as much as the things they did pass. And then lastly, as Jefferson City is always known for, some of the drama or extracurricular activity that kind of marked the 2021 session. And so I thought I'd start there just because to get it out of the way. Obviously, the session was marred by COVID, and it had a big impact, not only on the type of bills that they discussed this year, but just on the proceedings themselves. And almost initially in January, the biggest impact was they did have to shut down for a bit because of a COVID outbreak among staff and legislators. And then maybe the highest profile incident of the session regarding COVID was the State of the State address, which the governor historically holds in the House chamber. But coming on the heels of an outbreak, the Republican leadership was just apprehensive about having everybody gather with guests and lawmakers and lobbyists and interest groups in the chamber to hear the governor's speech, and just decided that they weren't going to allow him to do that. They wanted him to either record it in an empty chamber or deliver it live without, the full House in session. He wasn't happy with that. He ended up delivering it in the Senate, and then just a few days later got into a really public spat with the Speaker of the House, Rob Vescovo, about this, writing a really nasty letter accusing House leadership of trying to undermine him and embarrass him, which was very strange, to say the least. It's another example of when there's supermajorities of Republicans and they control all the levers of power. This is true of Democrats as well. We just haven't seen Democrats in control of things in a while. They're going to find ways to disagree with each other and cause drama. And this session put that on full display. And it kind of bookended at the end of the session when the Senate sort of collapsed because of differences between leadership and its kind of rank and file conservative caucus members, that led to just the last day of session basically being thrown away because of feelings of betrayal, that leadership kind of hung its more moderate members out to dry. And some of those hard feelings kind of linger on to this day. In addition to some of those strange COVID-related disturbances throughout the year, and we'll get to the end of the session soon too, because that does get into the special, but this was also the year that saw the first person since the Civil War that was actually booted from the Missouri legislature. Rick Raber, was a state rep from Lee Summit, which is a Jackson County city just outside of Kansas City. He was accused by his adult children of sexual and physical abuse when they were younger. This came out before the election. He was actually still won his seat in November of 2020, and almost immediately was basically excommunicated from the party. They refused to allow him to caucus with Republicans. They launched an ethics committee investigation and eventually determined he needed to be thrown out of the House because of these allegations. He tried to quit before he could be thrown out. And in one of the strangest things I've witnessed in my career, it was the sort of the inverse of "you can't fire me because I quit." They actually said, "You can't quit because we're going to fire you." They refused to allow him to resign, came back a few days later and kicked him out, basically assuring he can't run again. And there was another member from the St. Louis area, Democrat Wiley Price, that was censured for accusations he had had a sexual relationship with an intern and had retaliated against the staff member who was going to report that. Again, first House member to ever be censured, sort of another historic first for Missouri. And then lastly, we had Patricia Durges, who's a state rep from Nixa, who in February was indicted on 20 felony counts by federal prosecutors for allegedly running a fake stem cell treatment scheme and for misusing CARES Act funds. She was supposed to have her trial this week. It's been delayed until next year. So she will serve yet another term, another session, I should say, in sort of exile. Says she was also booted from her caucus, removed from committees, removed from her office. She has this strange windowless closet of an office. I don't know if it was an attempt to kind of forced her to want to resign, or if but that's where they stuck her. So that's the drama part. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff I'm forgetting, but those are sort of the high watermarks of the strange drama of Jeff City this year. Then secondly, there's no doubt this year that they did pass a lot of really historic legislation. They, for the first time ever, enacted a prescription drug monitoring program, which has been a long time coming. There was a huge police reform bill that included a ban on chokeholds, included a conviction integrity unit, which is something that the prosecutors in Kansas City and in St. Louis have been pushing for, so that they can review past convictions. And if they find that there was wrongdoing and that the person that was convicted was innocent, they can begin a process that could free them from prison. There was also a push for not charter schools, but vouchers, essentially, for public school kids to go to private school. There's been efforts to enact meaningful, quote unquote, education reform and school choice for, as long as I've been in Missouri, and probably a lot longer. It's always kind of run up against just a steamroller of opposition, because it's not necessarily a partisan issue. It's very geographic, pits rural versus urban, suburban, conservative versus moderate. There's no easy defining lines there. And so those bills often just run into problems I've seen over and over again. And this year they finally got one across the finish line. Now, how it will work in practice is somewhat still up in the air. They're still trying to work a lot of those things out. It has the feel of a bill that is just let's pass this and we can fix it later, because it's a lot easier to fix something that's not working than it is to actually pass something brand new. They had the votes, they got it across the finish line. Ironically, they couldn't really send it back to the House when there were some issues that were brought up in the Senate, because they had kicked out Rick Raber, and he was the 82nd vote that they needed. And so without him having been booted from the legislature, they didn't have enough votes to pass it again if it had been sent back to the House from the Senate. So they had to work out this strange compromise where they passed a second bill that kind of trimmed the first bill. There's still some issues that folks have pointed out. It feels like the type of bill also that's going to end up in a sort of an inevitable lawsuit. Someone is going to file litigation at some point to try to block that. We've seen it in other states, but the premise of it being that there's going to be a special tax credit fund that folks can receive a tax benefit for donating to a scholarship to help kids who want to go to a private school. I'm just looking at my list here of some of the other bills. They passed legislation that would raise the gas tax, which is something that they've been pushing for a long time. It's obviously raised the ire of some on the conservative side of the aisle, but they did it in such a way where it wouldn't have to go on the ballot, because every time a tax increase goes on the ballot in Missouri, it gets beaten down pretty badly, including gas tax increases in recent years. So they're going to increase it incrementally over time in order to pump some money into the transportation infrastructure system, because for years, MoDOT, the Missouri Department of Transportation, has been begging for more funding to help fix these crumbling roads and bridges around the state. And then they, back on the police reform, they also passed a few things to target the quote unquote defunding of the police, put some measures in place that would keep local governments from being able to cut their police budgets over a certain amount of time. And then, as we sort of touched on, COVID obviously interfered with some of the ways in which the legislature was able to function, but there was also legislation that it inspired. Most notably, as if those of you in the St. Louis area know, there was some provisions put in place to try to keep local governments from being able to enact restrictions for these sorts of pandemics and health issues. There's still some questions about exactly how it will work in principle, but the idea being that you wouldn't have just this sort of blanket, stay-at-home order from the local Department of Health that would shut businesses down. It would have to go to the local governing body. There would have to be a vote, and they'd have to come back periodically and re-up that. And most folks think that what that will do in actual practice is you'll see very few of these things enacted in the future, because the political will just won't be there. When you start adding, all these new levers of power into the process. But we shall see. We've already kind of seen St. Louis County, this issue's played out. I think, they're still tangling about it in court, and we'll see if that has meaningful impact on similar sort of mask mandates in Kansas City and other places around the state. They passed legislation that limited legal actions against businesses in relation to something like the COVID-19 pandemic, essentially out of an existential fear that folks would try to there would be this flood of lawsuits from people who, if they went to a bar and caught the Delta variant, that there'd be some legal liability. So those are some of the big things that passed this year, and I know I'm leaving out a lot, and that's why I want to kind of leave some time open till the very end to let you guys ask some questions. But the other big category that I mentioned is things that didn't get done this year. And the two big ones were the FRA and Medicaid expansion. They adjourned without approving the FRA extension, and what that is, the federal reimbursement allowance, which is just a fancy way of saying it's a tax on providers of healthcare, hospitals, nursing homes, et cetera, that helps fund a substantial portion of our Medicaid system. It's been without much drama for years and years. They've just approved that since the early 90s. This year, it got wrapped up in the debate over contraceptives and over Planned Parenthood providing services under Medicaid. And as you can imagine, in Missouri, those are topics that tend to bring out some for pretty fierce political opposition. So they couldn't get that approved before they adjourned this year, and it forced them to come back into special session. The fight sort of continued, and it was this strange, dividing lines where the conservative caucus was railing on its leadership, demanding that these provisions be put into the FRA. And the leadership of the party saying, look, if we do that, we're going to be out of compliance with federal law, and that could jeopardize our entire system. And ultimately, what kind of saved the day for the FRA was a bipartisan kind of group of women that, came together and essentially, just paraphrasing, you just say, hey guys, knock it off. You're out of your depth here. Don't screw around with this. You can't go in here and start banning some of the contraceptives they were talking about not wanting to fund are things that would be prescribed to women with, breast cancer or, people who have other medical conditions. And, it became an issue where the conservative caucus's push just they couldn't hold their line. And so the FRA was eventually extended. And if it hadn't been, it would have been just a financial disaster for the state. It would have been leaving hundreds of millions of dollars in Medicaid funding on the table, and all the matching money that they would get from the feds. So they got that approved finally after some gnashing of teeth. And then secondly, they, as you know, last year, voters approved Medicaid expansion. The governor included it in his proposed budget, but the legislature decided to take that money out. And so when the session ended, the presumption of the executive branch was that they weren't going to be enrolling people who would otherwise have qualified under that voter approved expansion. There was a lawsuit filed. Initially, the courts didn't agree, but by the time it got to the Supreme Court, there was a unanimous decision that sided with the plaintiffs that said, look, you don't have to put the money in there. You have the power of the purse strings, but you can't discriminate against the population that's coming in, this expansion population. You can't say that, well, we funded the other people, we didn't fund them. If you run out of money, you run out of money, and that's the legislature's problem. And the dirty secret for those who don't follow the legislature closely is they always run out of money. They're always back in the legislative session for what's called a supplemental budget, because they didn't put enough money into the Medicaid system, and it needed more, or else it might run out. So that's what's going to happen now, presumably. I guess never say never. The legislature has a way of discovering new and inventive chicanery to keep everybody interested and to keep me busy. But ultimately, that is what is presumed, is the legislature is going to have to come back, and either in January, most likely, or perhaps in a special if it becomes necessary, and put that money in there, because they only budgeted for the current population, not for 275,000 new people expected to join the program thanks to the expanded eligibility. And so I think that is everything, in a nutshell. I'm sure I, like I said, forgot a lot and probably buzzed through some things a little too quick. The next thing that's on the horizon that's going to get everybody's attention is redistricting. They've set the public hearings for drawing the maps for the legislative districts, and then the legislature will actually be drawing the congressional districts. There's a chance that we'll have a special session to do some of that stuff, but most likely it'll be handled when we get back in January. And it'll be that'll be the next big fight, not only amongst Republicans and Democrats, but even just amongst Republicans. Again, always looking for new ways to fight each other. As Roy Blunt's not running again, and everybody's running for something else now, either for Senate, or they're running for the congressional seats that are left open by those who are running for Senate, or the state legislative seats that are left open by the people who are running for Congress, that are left open by the people running for Senate. It's this chain reaction of him not running that should make redistricting a cluster, to say the least. And ultimately, we'll see if the legislators can get their act together and actually draw the lines. So with that, I'm not the MC here, but I'm happy to answer anybody's questions, or to go into more detail about any sort of issues that you guys might have. So.
Jason, I know that last session was very focused on bills targeting trans children.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think those bills are going to come up again, or do you think they're just going to be so focused on critical race theory that they're going to let that slide?
They will definitely be focused on critical race theory, I'm sure. Those were two big issues that somehow ended up getting kind of locked together, which made them both so unpalatable to enough people to where they acted as like an anchor to each other and killed themselves. I do think that those are issues that are going to come back up. I could never get a sense of exactly how much momentum the bills that were targeting trans youth had. Obviously they had hearings, and obviously there were votes in the House. I can't remember if it passed the House or it didn't, but it wasn't a huge groundswell of support for this. And some of it is just because it's sort of a new issue, and sort of a very small group, even within the Republican Party, are really outraged about that. But I'm positive it will come back up. There are legislators who that is a big issue for them, and it's something that they're going to want to have more debate on. And to your point on critical race theory, that's an issue that's only getting louder and louder. The chair of the Senate Education Committee has sort of made that one of her pet projects this summer, is trying to weed out which school districts are teaching that in the 1619 project. And so I think both of those issues are going to be front and center for some Republicans when we return in January. The question is, will it be enough when they do have all these other things that are going to take up a lot of oxygen, such as redistricting or efforts to rein in Medicaid spending. So, but I do think they're going to get some time next year for sure. And let's not forget it's an election year, and sort of playing to the base is never bad politics in Missouri. So.
Does anyone else have any questions? Because I've got lots. Can you talk, so this week NCJW is going to be down in Jefferson City. They're having a hearing about, on Monday it's about critical race theory, but on Tuesday it's about revising the initiative petition policies. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an issue it has come up a lot over the years. As Republican supermajorities have grown, you see a lot of the issues that would fall under the more liberal or Democratic side finding their way through the initiative petition onto the ballot and winning, whether that be Medicaid expansion, which we talked about. Medical marijuana probably falls under that. There was an increase to the minimum wage. Even dating back, a few years, there was renewable energy standards. There was, puppy mills. A lot of things end up on the ballot. And sort of two things. One, the Republican-led legislature often tinkers with stuff when folks try to change just the state law. And puppy mills and renewable energy standards are two examples, but also even campaign finance reform. So folks started going the next step and putting things in the Constitution. And so that's kind of spooked the legislature even more, that these things are being enshrined in the Constitution, makes them a lot harder to change. Not impossible to change. We saw that with Clean Missouri. They came back, put a new initiative on the ballot, and that one was successful in how we draw our legislative districts. But I think there's a lot of appetite amongst the Republican leadership for messing around with how the initiative petition process works in order to make it a little bit harder, whether that's increasing the number of signatures it would take to get something on the ballot, increasing the money it would take, because there is an awful lot of work the Secretary of State's office has to do on these. They're trying to make the argument that there should be some sort of financial compensation to ensure that the state doesn't bear the brunt of, a group filing 30 different versions of of initiative petition in order to find the right language. Raising the threshold. If you want to amend the Constitution, should you have to get a supermajority of 60% or 65%? These are all ideas that are on the table. Historically, they've run into like a strange motley crew of opposition between, organized labor and Rex Singfield. Those are two groups that never really got along on anything except the idea that the legislature shouldn't be tinkering with how we put things on the ballot through the initiative process. So I think you're definitely going to see that again. And especially I think it's going to be early in the session next year, because if they want to change it, they're going to have to change it quickly in order to avoid whatever next thing could end up on the ballot in the fall, whether that's expansion of marijuana legalization, which is something that's being circulated, or there's been talk of things like voting rights, putting different voting initiatives on the ballot to ensure, whether that be early voting or expanded, remote voting. So I do think that's going to be a big priority for Republicans coming into the session. It's just, overcoming some of that built-in opposition that, again, isn't necessarily always ideological, could be a big issue for them.
I have a question about the new Missouri law that invalidates the federal laws, gun laws, if they feel it infringes on Second Amendment rights.
Mm-hmm.
And how could that be?
That's a good question. There's actually a hearing today on that very question of how could that be. St. Louis filed suit, St. Louis City and County, to block that law, saying that it is unconstitutional, that a state can't just unilaterally nullify a federal law. Just yesterday, the Department of Justice filed a brief in that lawsuit, kind of noting the different ways in which law enforcement have begun to stop working with the federal government on weapons and drug crimes out of concern that they would run afoul of that law. Because the thing about that is not just that it tries to say you shouldn't enforce these, it actually implements fines, and a law enforcement agency could face up to a $50,000 fine if they are found to have infringed upon someone's Second Amendment rights. And some law enforcement apparently are taking that as they don't want to dance too closely to that and end up in court and have to defend their actions. And so they're backing out of things like ATF task forces or providing certain information, to federal authorities as they do some of these criminal investigations. It's an idea that's floated around for a while. It nearly became law a few years ago. Jay Nixon, when he was governor, vetoed it, and they fell one vote short of overriding that veto in the Senate. It finally got some traction this year. It tends to die for a while when there's a Republican in the White House and come back up when there's a Democrat, which I think makes sense if you're looking at it from the perspective of, they're not necessarily afraid. They weren't afraid that Donald Trump was going to enact any sort of gun control or gun restrictions, but they do have fear of Joe Biden trying to enact those things. And so, I think it's going to play out in court as to whether the legislature overstepped its bounds. Most people, when it was passing, the Democrats who opposed it didn't use the filibuster to try to kill it, because they said it'd be a waste of our energy because this thing's just going to get thrown out when it gets to court. So we'll see how solid those predictions are. It starts out in Cole County Court, which is, it's an area where the judges are elected. It's in Daniel Green's court, who's a Republican judge, which is not to say that he will vote which way he'll rule, but it seems like this is going to find its way up the ladder. This won't, whatever happens today in court and ultimately when the judge makes his verdict, that won't be the last say on the constitutionality of what's referred to as the Second Amendment Preservation Act.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Could you, excuse me, Jason, could you go into a little more detail about the redistricting process, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of years ago, it's before COVID, so it could have been 50 years ago, or it could have been two. It's hard to say. I think it was 2018 when voters passed Clean Missouri. They envisioned a process that had a nonpartisan demographer drawing legislative districts with the idea of partisan fairness as a high priority. Republicans reacted to this idea very badly. And analysis of the plan predicted that there'd be a lot of Democratic pickups, that when you start to draw these districts with partisan fairness in mind, you start to see there was still, even with that, very little chance Democrats would crawl out of the minority, but they would definitely lower the margins quite a bit. And so Republicans put their own plan on the ballot through the legislature that reverted back somewhat to the old method. There are bipartisan commissions that will draw these maps. 10 Democrats and 10 Republicans. They are not, partisan fairness is not part of the equation. They're looking for compactness. They're looking for trying to keep communities of interest together. And if they fail, if these committees of deadlock and can't draw the maps, then there'll be judges that end up drawing them. And I don't know how the process will play out, but I do know that their first meeting was a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was last week. And it took them several hours just to choose a chairman. It took them several hours to just agree on the blocking and tackling of how to organize as a committee, because they just kept locking over and over again on a 10-10 vote. It wasn't the most auspicious beginning to this bipartisan process, and I presume it might be a foreboding of things to come when this commission meets. But they're tasked. There's a Senate committee that will draw 34 Senate districts, and there is a House committee that will draw 163 House districts, and that's for the legislature. As far as the congressional districts, that's the legislature's job to draw those. With the governor's consent. So the governor would sign or veto any map that they sent to him. There's been a lot of talk about whether Republicans can draw a map that takes Democrats down to one seat. There's very little chance that Cori Bush's seat could be messed with to the point where a Republican could win it. But there are maps out there in the world that show that maybe Emmanuel Cleaver, Kansas City's Democratic congressman, they could draw it to where he would have a more competitive district than he does right now. And that would give Republicans every seat. If that was the case, it'd be 7 Republican leaning seats and 1 Democrat leaning seat. I imagine Republicans are going to explore that option, and I imagine they're going to get pressure from Washington to explore that option, that more Republicans is better. But you also have to consider folks want to run in easy districts. And so drawing a 7-1 map becomes a map in which, if there's a wave year, you may have a few Democrats, win. If it's a 55-45 seat, that's a winnable seat. If it's a really big Democratic year, or there's, as we've seen in Missouri, if there's a scandal or just a really impressive candidate on the Democratic side, most people think that at the end of the day, especially with all the wrangling about people wanting to kind of move up, leave the legislature and run for Congress, leave Congress and run for Senate, that they're going to try to draw as safe Republican districts as possible. And that would ultimately mean leaving Cleaver and Bush's seats alone. But the time will tell on that. They, like I said, they could call a special session to try to do that work. I'm hearing, word that that's probably not in the cards. And so they'll have to come back in January. And this whole process is delayed because of the pandemic. Census numbers are usually out a lot sooner. They would have already either finished the work or started the work at least, but they just got the census numbers in the last couple of weeks, and that pretty much kicks off the process. And so they're going to be under the gun to try to get this done before people have to start filing to run for office, which I believe is in April. Somebody on this call probably knows that, but so they may end up having to move that deadline. We have a very early, we have an August primary, so they can't move it too far, because then you start getting into the situation where you're running into the problems with, absentee ballots for folks who overseas, like the military. It just sort of sets off a cascading effect if they can't show up in Jeff City and get the work done quickly. But again, I think you're going to find a lot of people who, I want this district for myself so I can run, and this map isn't going to do that for me. You're going to see a lot of that kind of fighting amongst Republican lawmakers when they return to draw these maps. And so, as everything in Missouri, this is why we can't have nice things. So that is the big thing that I'm sure they'll be tackling when they first get back in January.
Diana, do you want to ask your question? You have to unmute.
Yes, I'm happy to ask it.
It's a good one that many of us have.
Okay, good. Well, I noticed last week, Tony Messenger had an article about many of the state legislators that were so on board for mandating vaccines for meningitis for students that wanted to live on college campuses when there was an outbreak in, I think it was 2014, and another uptick in 2016. And many of the legislators that were absolutely on board with that are now so opposed to mandating COVID vaccines. So my question is, what, if anything, can we do to encourage our legislators to take politics out of this and let healthcare decisions be made based on health issues, not politics?
That's the $1 million question, I suppose, right? I mean, we're in a situation now where so much of our politics is guided by who can emerge from the primary that, I don't know where everyone on this particular call lives. But if you don't live in a district that is dominated by, Republican primary voters, your voice might not get through to a lot of these, I read that column that Tony did, and he kind of focused in on Eric Schmidt and, Governor Parson as well. But, Eric Schmidt is running to be a US Senator. And this is Donald Trump's party now. And a lot of the rhetoric that you see is sort of courting those Trump voters. And it's particularly interesting with Eric Schmidt because, I came to Missouri in 2011. He had been in office, I think, for a year at that point, maybe a little bit longer. And his reputation was of this very, moderate, suburban, Republican, pro-labor, socially conservative, but mostly would fall on more of the economic conservative side. And he's sort of gone through a transition in the last few years as his ambitions towards statewide office and beyond have grown. And that is just a reflection of the modern Republican Party at large, and also here in Missouri, that, it's the Trump voter that is risen to prominence. And so if you look at that Senate primary, everyone's sort of trying to court that, whether it's Eric Schmidt, whether it's our, former governor, they're all sort of aiming at the same demographic. And that's a demographic that's very skeptical of the vaccine and is very opposed to any sort of mandate. And so I think you're going to see whether it's hypocrisy or whether it's evolving on the issue. It's just sort of, it depends on your spin or your perspective, how gracious you feel like being to the Honorable Attorney General. But there has been an evolution on a lot of these things. I mean, even more recent. I mean, the entire response to the pandemic from the governor's mansion was to focus on local control and this idea of the decisions that are on the closest to the ground are going to be the ones that are best. A resistance to any sort of statewide mandate, whether that be a mask mandate or what have you. But the governor also signed the bill that very much hamstrung or limited a local government's ability to weigh in on a lot of these issues of pandemic response. It'll be interesting to see when school goes back. I live in Columbia. We have a mask mandate here. There hasn't been any lawsuits filed to stop Columbia Public Schools from mandating masks, but there's a lot of whispers in the air that might be something that comes down the pike. Is that local control? If that's such a core tenet of the Republican Party here in Missouri, it's interesting for that to have fallen by the wayside in less than a year. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question of what you can do, it's sort of the wave of the Republican Party in Missouri right now, and probably at large in our country. And is that a fever that breaks, or is that the Republican Party as it is here to stay? I mean, it's probably above my pay grade.
Ann Ross has a question. Do you want to ask it, or would you like me to say it? Is there a number of how much the state has paid in attorney bills from frivolous lawsuits? Do you know anything about that?
Well, it's funny because, and this is something that goes back years and years, but like you always ask the Attorney General's office how much they're paying for these sorts of litigations. I can imagine which ones in particular she's asking about, but and they won't break out those costs because they're handled by lawyers inside the office. These are government employees doing the work. I mean, I guess the question ultimately comes down to not so much the cost, but what else are they supposed to be doing? Because there's a finite amount of resources. And I think that's a question folks are beginning to ask of the Attorney General, is this idea of, we're suing, there are a lot of lawsuits against the federal government or against China or against, local municipalities over mask mandates. And so there's a lot of resources being put into those lawsuits. Are there areas in which are potentially not getting the attention they deserve? Whether that's, there's consumer protection law, there's environmental law, there is, the Sunshine Law, which is something we've run into time and again. And so, unfortunately, I couldn't put a dollar figure on it. But I think whether there's a dollar figure to be like pinned down, there's certainly a resource question. That's a fair question to be asked of the Attorney General's office is, where is the priority that you're placing? How does it all fit in to the pie of available resources available to the Attorney General? So.
Going back to the COVID, sorry, Linda, did you have?
No, I was just saying thank you.
Yeah.
I had to unmute first.
Going back to the COVID question, we were talking with Senator Shoup yesterday, and she thinks that, and this is kind of off the record, that COVID is going to be the real big issue next session, and nothing's going to get done until we're back to as normal as we can be. What do you think on, and I don't know if everyone knows this, but unfortunately, the husband of a legislator passed away from COVID. We just found out this morning, and these were two people who were against vaccines, or get at least until FDA approval. Do you think that that's going to have any impact, or are they just gonna are they gonna stick to their, for lack of a better term, stick to their guns on this?
Well, I mean, if past is prologue, when COVID reached Missouri in March, I have a strange little personal insight on it, because the House shut down, the Senate shut down, the session shut down shortly after the first cases were reported in Missouri. Part of the reason is my intern went to a conference before we realized that we weren't allowed to do things like that, and there was an exposure, and she was sort of the typhoid Mary of the Missouri legislature, and she was negative. She did not catch COVID, but just that was enough to spook them to adjourn or for weeks at a time. When they came back, they were very cautious. Votes were taken in batches. The House has 163 members. They were calling people to the floor in batches to promote social distancing. There was masks. It was just eerie. It was an eerie scene, because again, they were just taking it so very seriously. They were holding committee hearings, but everything was remote. They were trying to ensure public safety to a very extreme degree. That faded slowly but surely over time. And by the time they reconvened at the end of the 2020 session, masks were somewhat common, but not universal. Everything was sort of back to kind of crammed, crowded committee rooms. And by the time they returned in January, it was, masks were probably 50-50 and declined. It's slowly but surely throughout. And this is before most folks were getting vaccinated. So if the question is when they return in January, will things be back to normal? My assumption, unless something dramatically changes, is that we'll return in January. We'll return in September for a veto session, and then we'll return again in January, and things will just be as they always were, with folks either wear masks or they don't. Probably more Democrats than not. But even by the end of the session this last year, Democrats had stopped wearing masks because they just came to the conclusion of, I'm vaccinated. Nobody here is wearing a mask. I can't socially distance. This is foolish. If I'm in danger, I'm in danger. And they just sort of left it at that. I continued wearing a mask throughout, but when I would interview Democrats, they'd be like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm vaccinated. I can go get a mask if you'd like to talk to me. So, we'll see if the Delta variant is sort of burned through. Hopefully by then, maybe things are somewhat back to normal in society, whatever normal means. But I do think the legislature, unless, when folks get sick, it tends to kind of wake people up. And if there's a big outbreak, as we've seen last year, the House did take time off to kind of make sure if there was any exposures that those would kind of burn out. But I don't see it being a big thing that slows progress down, again, unless there's a major breakout in the legislature amongst lawmakers. And there's so many that are vaccine resistant, not hesitant, but just plainly resistant, that it wouldn't surprise me if there were some problems with outbreaks in the legislative session. But again, I don't see it as something that's going to slow things down very much.
Does anyone have any other questions? Well, if not, thank you, Jason, so much. This was very, very informative.
I had put one in the chat, Jen.
Oh, you did? I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Do you want to go ahead and ask?
Sure. I'm just curious on the same subject. If there are any numbers on any public numbers on how many of the state legislators and public officials have been vaccinated, and can we get that information?
And ultimately, that would be up to them to share. We've been asking, reporters have been asking, especially from those that are, kind of publicly vaccine hesitant or resistant. Presumably those would be the folks that would not be vaccinated. But, the Post-Dispatch has done a pretty good job of trying to get the Senate candidates on the record to varying degrees of success. Everyone, it seems though most are vaccinated. Eric Greitens is not vaccinated, and Mark McCloskey won't say. A lot of folks, it's just a matter of there's not a database or a mandate that if they are or aren't vaccinated, they say so. I think, especially when they come back in January, some of that might come to fruition, because if you are vaccinated, hopefully, presumably, you'll be able to kind of navigate the legislative session a little bit more freely and openly. But yeah, but you do see there's been bipartisan efforts down in Southwest Missouri, and I think it was in St. Louis County, I know in the Kansas City area, where Republicans and Democratic lawmakers got together to organize vaccine clinics and try to encourage constituents to come out. So it's not necessarily a partisan thing, but, we reported just yesterday, there was a pharmacy, a Hy-Vee pharmacy that was doing vaccine clinics just out front of the Capitol. It was not organized by the government, was not authorized. It was, we're willing to do this. If any staff or lawmakers or state employees want to come out and get a vaccine, we'll be here from X to X. Someone sent that out so that the world would know, like, hey, staff, legislators, please, if you would like one, it's out there, it's available. This was not a demand or anything. And there was a lawmaker that took great umbrage to the fact that that was happening and said that the government shouldn't be in the jab business, I believe is how he phrased it. But so, I think, I imagine a majority of our elected officials are probably vaccinated. I know a majority of our congressional delegation is, if not all of them at this point. And, folks like Billy Long, Southwest Missouri Republican, has been adamant about, like, please talk to your doctor, get your shot. So, but there's always, I imagine there's also quite a large minority that are not going to get vaccinated. And as, Jen mentioned, Steve Walsh was the press secretary for Vicky Hartzler, who's the husband of Sarah Walsh, who's a congressional candidate and a state rep. He passed away today after several weeks of, hospitalization because of COVID. Neither were vaccinated. And Sarah had said that she was waiting for FDA approval. And so, does something like that, like a tragedy of that magnitude, change some minds? I honestly don't know. At this point, I would think we've all seen enough tragedy to where you would think that we have seen enough. But yeah, so, but to answer your initial question, no, there's not a definitive list of who is and isn't vaccinated, I'm afraid. So, but that's something I think, especially for you all, that's a fair question, I think, of your local elected official, especially if they're quiet on the vaccine issue. Are they vaccinated? If not, why not? And if so, why aren't they speaking out on the issue and trying to encourage vaccinations?
And can we, I guess the other alternative is to put pressure on the press to try and unearth this information and make it more public.
It's probably a question we should be asking anytime we interact with an elected official, quite honestly. As again, especially for those that are either silent or hesitant, because if you're not out advocating for vaccinations and you are vaccinated, that's, some would see that as a dereliction of your duty as an elected official. So I think you're right on that folks like me, when we do interact with electeds, because we get more interaction with them for better or worse than you all probably do, that's probably a question that should be on the agenda. Yeah.
Diana, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. One other question I just thought about. A lot of us had been involved in working with Senator Shoup on the VESA bill that was attached to another bill in the House and was passed and signed by the governor. And my question is, what is the actual process of how a bill that's passed begins to be put into use? Because a few years ago, we passed a human trafficking bill, and I'm not even sure if to this day it's really fully effective with what the bill was supposed to do.
And
So
that's
I'm
interesting that you brought that up, because yesterday also Senator Shoup was telling us that the bill that she got passed that would provide for a year of postpartum mental health care, they've done nothing. The DSS has done nothing to implement that. So that's a very good question.
Yeah. With a lot of these bills and these regulations and these new laws, they do kind of they're sort of cast into the bureaucracy. It's up to the agencies to implement rules in order to enforce these, whatever they might be. Some of them are easy, right? If something's now against the law, then it's just a matter of police will arrest you if you do that thing. But if it's a new program or if it's a new system or a way of doing things, there is a process where they have to establish rules, and that has to be a public process. And there is time that it takes in order to implement that stuff. But that is a consistent complaint among a lot of legislators, that departments are not moving quickly enough and sort of dragging their feet on implementing some of the things that the legislature has put into law. And you see those questions arising too. Another bill that was pretty well publicized was dealing with Christian boarding schools and some of these allegations of abuse from unlicensed facilities. The department is going to have to start putting rules into place in order to start implementing those things. And the fear is that if they drag their feet, then these are just, it's a toothless proposition. It's a law on paper only. Medicaid expansion, the government was supposed to begin the process of drafting a way to get all these new people enrolled. They abandoned that process when the legislature didn't put the money in, and now they're facing, the judge telling them they have to enroll. They're asking for more time in order to get this thing stood up and running. So, yeah, sometimes it shouldn't take as long as it does, it feels. But that is, like I said, the process. There is a time that it will have to take in order for it to play out in a transparent way within the bureaucracy. But if there's resistance within, and this again, it's, I don't want it to seem like this is a partisan thing. Republicans used to complain about the Nixon administration dragging his feet on things that he didn't agree with and just sort of dragging it out as long as he could. So this is something that goes back a long time. It's, the executive branch is the one that implements and executes these laws. And so they have a lot of power in how they do so. And yeah, this is why, people can get frustrated with government sometimes when it takes so long. And on the worst case scenario, something like, as Jen mentioned, that, could be a year out and there's been no progress, it seems.
So maybe what we need to do, just like we all band together and start making phone calls and writing emails and texting our legislators to pass the bills, maybe we need to, who do we need to contact to get these different agencies moving on that? Is it more letters to the editor or contact directly or what?
I mean, telling a press member is never a bad idea. We always accept all tips, but the legislature holds the purse strings, and as I've said, when they've been frustrated over the years with how the bureaucracy has handled things, they've demonstrated that, and they can get things moving a lot faster because of that. I've seen them defund positions out of being upset with how the department has held up certain laws or reacted to certain things, not being as forthcoming or providing records to lawmakers. So it never hurts to talk to your legislator, because it is a bipartisan thing. Like, if it passed and became law, it certainly didn't do it because the Democrats wanted it. It had to have some Republican support. And so if there is a problem with how the law is being implemented by the departments, that's the remedy, is for the legislature to say, hey, you guys need to get on this, or else there's going to be some repercussions.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, Jason, thank you again so much for lending us your time to speak to us today about this. I think that you gave a very good overview for, like, in layman's terms, and for ways for us to understand a lot better about this process and what happened last sessions. We really, really appreciate it. And keep your eyes open in your email for a little gift of our thanks. Thank you all again so much for coming today. Please keep your eyes open in your email. We are sending out a an evaluation, if you would be so kind as to fill that out for us. It'll take you like 2 minutes. That would be wonderful. And do not forget, next Tuesday, we have the event's called Making History. It's our kind of bonus lunch and learn that we're doing with JCRC, Senator Brian Williams and Representative Shamed Dogan about their policies they got passed last session on police reform and others. And then also next month's Lunch and Learn with Denise Lieberman. We'd love for you to join us. And if we don't see you before then, everyone have a very happy new year and an easy fast. And we will see you soon. Thank you.